Okay, well, again, hello everyone, and welcome to today's virtual training workshop. It's material and application, essentially. We are live and being recorded on October 13th of 2022. So thank you, thank you, thank you. It's 10 a.m. Eastern, 9 a.m. Central, 8 a.m. Mountain, and 7 a.m. Pacific, and then 6 a.m. for my Alaska folks. Again, thank you guys so much. Definitely appreciate y'all taking the time to be here today. So your main facilitators for today's session is going to be Owista Atkins. She's our training and development coordinator for the Native Learning Center, and then myself as well. I am Crystal Cedino, the training and development manager for the Native Learning Center. A few of the names that I see listed on the attendance here today are familiar. So, and that typically happens. We get a lot of people who attend more than one of the sessions, which is great. So again, just thank you. All right, so just an introduction into the Microsoft Teams platform. Now there's a couple of different versions. We've had issues in the past with chat functions and so on and so forth. So just bear with us as we get through them. And we're going to try and help troubleshoot any of those issues that you might have through the chat box. Like I said, we have Lewis, Owista, and myself to help with, all of those needs today. So we're definitely keeping an eye out on that chat box. But essentially, if you are coming from the web browser version, I will say that all of your functions should either be hovered at the bottom. So if you hover your mouse towards the bottom of your screen, or I know in Vince's case, they're just at the bottom and some things look slightly different. But with that being said, you should have access to your camera if you have one, microphone access as well. We do encourage, when there is a moment for questions or anything like that, jumping in and using your voice. If you're not comfortable with that, there is no issue with using the chat box. So we definitely encourage that participation and question asking. We're here to answer as many of those questions and concerns as possible. So definitely take advantage of today's all-day session because we are going to be here from 10 a.m. Eastern Standard Time all the way to 5:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. If we finish early, I call that the gift of time. But we definitely want to give you all the ability to ask and, question anything that you might have on your minds. Other than that, like I said, you have that chat function. I believe most participants can share the screen. So if there comes to a time where you actually do need.
Did you do rice?
Oh, so sorry. Do you mind muting them? Thank you. What was I saying? If there is a time towards maybe the end, if you wanted to share something or anything along those lines, that feature is there. And then just keep in mind that that red button to hang up is literally to leave the call. So unless you're trying to do so, I definitely recommend avoiding that button. For those of you that are coming on the desktop application, usually everything's going to be on the upper right-hand corner of your screen. Now, we definitely recommend coming from the desktop. We just noticed there are usually less issues in that regard to the application. But again, either way is totally okay. Again, you have camera access, you have microphone access, chat functions. I believe there's also the option to do thumbs up and I think potentially raise your hand and a smiley face and a heart and so on and so forth. Feel free to use those emoticons as well. And then there's also the ability to blur your background and turn on captions and all of those kind of great things. Okay, feel free to play around with them. But with that being said, I'm going to go ahead and introduce Vince Franco. Just read a little bit of his bio. It's so great to have him back. But so Vince is the founder and owner of NVC, which is also known as Next Venture Consulting. And he develops and facilitates the training sessions and provides consulting services and or technical assistance. And before creating the NVC, Vince was the Compliance and Resource Development Director for the Native Learning Center, the Seminole Tribe of Florida, from 2011 to his retirement in August of 2022. We're very sad that he's no longer in the office with us, but we are definitely appreciative of him and all the work that he's done, in these last years. So, but in that capacity, he supervised $9 million of aggregate award proceeds, along with an annual $1 million of federal formula funding award of the Indian Housing Block Grant from the Office of Native American Programs, U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development. So Vince is just amazing. And we're definitely happy to have him here. And stay tuned for next week as well, because we do have some webinars. And then the following week, we also have a virtual training where we're going to be talking about NAHASDA and the OMBs and, just 2 CFR Part 200 and then 24 CFR Part 1000. So definitely be on the lookout for that. But otherwise, Vince, again, thank you so much for being here today. We appreciate you, and just take it on over.
Okay, all right. Thank you, Crystal. Thank you very much for the kind introduction and laying the groundwork. Am I coming through, by the way? My voice coming through?
Yes. Yes.
Okay, good, great. Thank you very much. Thank you, Crystal. Thank you, Awista. Thank you, Lewis, for the technical support. And hello, everybody. Welcome to basically the fundamentals of grant writing. And as Crystal had mentioned, it would be sure that you've muted your microphone as we go through, because there's so many of you, and just me and Crystal and Ovista and Lewis. There's very few on the speaking part, so there's just a lot of noise coming through. So please make sure that you're muted. And what I would suggest as we go through the program today, I am certainly not opposed in any way, shape, or form for any questions or concerns or comments that you have as we go through. And I will do my best to answer them. Thank you, Lisa. The best way to communicate with myself and with the other NOC support staff is through the chat box. And I will do my best to keep an eye on that. I know Crystal will do the same when she's in the program, to watch it and so if I miss it, and I will try not to, it's big and bold on my screen, so it's hard to miss. That's the best way for you to communicate with me if you have any questions or concerns. So
Vince, really quick, I make a recommendation? How about we have you turn off your camera and just speak through microphone, because you are kind of breaking up just a little bit. And I think it might be because of that.
Okay, all right. Is that I've turned off the camera.
Beautiful.
Is that better?
Yeah, I think so.
Better?
I'll let you know throughout the session if it wavers.
All right, and that's a good point, a really good point. All of our systems, I know, are sensitive a lot of times to weather. Right now, here in South Florida, the weather's beautiful, so I shouldn't have any concerns about storms coming through. But just so you know, folks, if I happen to lose connection at any time during the presentation today, do not worry, don't panic. I will come right back as soon as I can. In the past, rarely, but it has happened a couple times where I've lost a connection, but I eventually get back into the program. So if that does happen, if we lose a connection, don't worry. I will be back. I will do my best to get back. All right. Thank you, Crystal. That was a good point. So go ahead and leave the camera off, you think, at this point? Okay. So you'll just have to go with my voice from this point and whatever you see on the screen. And that's where I'm going now. I'm going to share something with you, or try to. Let's see if I can put up. No, it's not there. Bear with me for a second. I'm looking for the agenda. I want to put that up on the screen. Okay, there's the agenda. Okay. Give me back. Try that again. Okay. First of all, can you see that? Okay. I'm going to go full screen with it. Okay, good. All right. This is the agenda that we're going to follow today. Obviously, starting at 10 o'clock Eastern time. And again, as Crystal had mentioned, thank you very much for those of you that are in Mountain Time, Pacific Time, Alaska Time. I know it's a super early morning for you folks. Appreciate the fact that you're with us today for this. And we'll kind of start off very kind of slow. Again, this is the fundamental. So we're going to start slow and which would work, hopefully work well for those, with a very early morning. We'll work slow through some of the preliminary information, as you can see on the agenda here. We'll start with, well, we're beyond the welcome. We're going to get in a few minutes into the first section, which is key items for new grant writers based on my experience and information, best practices that are out there, 10 key items for new grant writers. And I'm assuming that a lot of you in attendance here are relatively new to grant writing, or this is your first exposure to grant writing. And if that's the case, you're in the right place, because that's basically what I'm going to be talking about today, the fundamentals. And I'm going to be laying a lot of the groundwork. As you can see in the agenda here, a lot of the preliminary fundamental groundwork before we get in to actual narrative writing, because I believe that grant writing is a holistic approach to what you're trying to do. Just like we did, back in when we were in high school and or when we were in college and we were tasked with the responsibility of writing a term paper or a research paper. You got to start somewhere, and really sitting down and trying to write a term paper or a novel or a persuasive story from scratch without doing any type of preliminary research, without any type of understanding of the fundamentals, is impossible. You can't just sit down and write a theme, a term paper on War and Peace, for example, if you haven't read the book, if you haven't done the research, if you don't understand the fundamentals, and if you don't have the skill sets that are needed to be able to put this all together, it's impossible to do that. And it would be equally impossible to search for grant opportunities if you don't know what you're looking for, if you don't understand the fundamentals. So that's what the morning is going to be here, and the early afternoon. We're going to go over the fundamentals of the big picture type things, and get more and more finite, more and more detailed as we move through the program until later this afternoon, when we finally get to the point where we're starting to break down the 7 components of putting together a successful grant narrative. I think it's rather impossible to be able to do that without understanding the fundamentals. So that's what you're seeing here on the agenda. 10:15 to 11, the 10 key items for new grant writers, followed by a section on soliciting information from the community, or community involvement or leadership involvement. Um, a lot of times for grant writers, we get the assignment to write a grant or search for grant opportunities, but it's really, really helpful. In fact, I would say it's a requirement that we get some kind of input and we solicit information from a larger group of individuals, be it leadership, be it the community at large within a tribal entity. So I'm going to talk about that in the latter part of the early morning. And then I'm going to segue in later this morning into developing the project team, because I firmly believe, and it's a best practice, that grant writing, it takes a village to write a grant. You want to be able to surround yourself with what I refer to as subject matter experts. So putting the project team or grant writing team or program team, whatever you want to call it, together and developing that is critical, because it really takes more than just one individual to be able to put together a successful grant. You need to have input, not just from the community, but from subject matter experts that are within your own organization or even outside your organization that you can tap into and get input to help you and others on your team, if you're fortunate enough to have a team, to be able to put together a successful grant focus. So talk about the project team development, and then I'll also talk about, in that same section, late morning, leveraging resources. And that could be anything from cost share, where the tribe puts in a certain percentage of money towards the grant, or it could be the use of equipment or other resources that are available within the tribe, or available through other relationships that you have, other partnerships that may exist with other organizations. And I'll talk about that too in that same section on leveraging. I'll talk about the use of leveraging resources and creating partnerships with other departments, with other organizations, with government entities and other agencies. That's all part of leveraging. And in that section, I'll also talk about the use of volunteer workforce, because volunteers are another resource, right? And if you're able to convert time and effort that volunteers put into any given effort, if you're able to convert that into a tangible figure, then it's something that can be used as a leverage. And so what do I mean by that? Um, Volunteers, if you were going to pay a volunteer to come in, what would that dollar amount be? This is the thought process that we have to go through. And if you're able to put a dollar amount on it, let's say you've got volunteers coming in to work 15 hours a week spread out over 5 days, right? And if that person were really a working person with a salary or a wage, perhaps you would pay them, just pick a number, $10 an hour, $15 an hour, plus maybe 30% in fringe benefits. You can do the math. What I'm trying to convey here is being able to convert volunteer services into some kind of tangible number. And if you can convert it into a number, then it becomes an asset. It becomes leverageable. So I'll talk about that in more detail when I'm leveraging resources and using partnerships and things like that. Then we'll break for lunch at 12 o'clock Eastern. I know that's mid-morning for you folks in California and Alaska, so sorry, you're going to have lunch mid-morning, but that's the way it is. By over here on the East Coast, we're going to go from 12 p.m. Eastern to 1 p.m. Eastern for lunch, so you can get back, and check your emails and do whatever, and then come back 1 o'clock Eastern and get into one of my favorite areas. It says Part 2A, the second half of the program, early afternoon, and getting into the SWOT analysis. Once you've got an idea and solicitation and information from the community or from your leadership, what your priorities are, then you need to be able to analyze where your strengths and weaknesses are within yourself, within your department, within the tribe, within the organization, to try to understand where those strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats are. So I'm going to walk through that process, that skill set of the SWOT analysis, so you can hopefully get a better understanding how to use that process to be able to fine tune what you're doing. And then from there, we'll segue into grant goal development using what's referred to as a logic model system. And I'll get into that in more detail in the early afternoon section, how to develop what's referred to as SMART goals that can transition into strategic plan, basically, for you to develop a program and move forward. Then we'll have an activity. It's called defining your major initiative, and Crystal and Oista and Lewis will help me with that group activity. And then we'll go into the second half of the afternoon and get into searching for grant opportunities. I will describe to you how to navigate, if you don't already know, how to navigate through some of the online portals that are out there to search for grant opportunities. For federal grant opportunities, we'll look at grants.gov. That is one of the largest online grant search mechanisms out there. And if you're not familiar with that, I'll give you a basic description of what it is, how to navigate your way through it, and how to look for grant opportunities that would hopefully fit what you've accomplished in the first half of this presentation, and that is figuring out what you're trying to do, the grant that you're trying to, or the need that you're trying to resolve through a grant. So we'll do that activity, then we'll take another break, and then part 3 down at the bottom where it says 3:15 to 4:15 Eastern time, then we'll finally get into the point where we'll actually talk about the grant narrative, the 7 components of a typical grant narrative. By that time, hopefully you'll have a good understanding of what you're looking at, how to get there, what the community is telling you to look for, and how to navigate your way through portals that are out there to search for a grant. And then the activity that you see there from 4:15 to 5:15 p.m. is the actual activity of you actually working together or by yourself to use the tools that you've learned and the description that I'm going to provide to you on the 7 components to actually put together the foundation, the basics of a grant narrative. And I'll go into that in much detail as we get closer to that. And that'll be the second activity where you actually put a grant narrative together based on either a real grant project that you're hoping to pursue, or a hypothetical one that we give you that you can work with. That'll be the second activity, and then we'll close up. So if you have any questions, I'm going to stop sharing that right now. And
sorry, Vince. Paulette, did you have a question? I see that you have your hand up.
I do. Could you hear me?
Yes.
yes.
Okay. So the public meetings, I have one set for next week. But is there a way, because we have maybe about 3,600 people in our community, but not every people like to really go to public meetings unless we got door prizes, and I'm not going to offer door prizes. But
Makes sense.
is there a way we could do like one public meeting and that'll be good for the year? But I know we are working on our housing needs assessment, so that's going to be very helpful. I'm just curious because for every grant, I don't want to keep having to go out for a public meeting. They're going to get sick of me by the time Christmas comes around and I won't have Christmas cards.
That makes sense. Vince,
that's a good question, a good observation. I've always considered that to be kind of a multimedia approach. You can do it as it sounds like you've described, face to face in a group session, but there might be other approaches that you can take. Written surveys, online surveys that can be done. It doesn't always have to be in a group session. And I understand also what you're saying about door prizes, and food. A lot of times food is an attraction. Being able to have food and beverage for these events, door prizes, make it fun for people. Get it. But in addition to that, there might be other mechanisms that you can use, like a written survey or an online survey. If your memberships, I know not everyone within the tribe might not have access, to computers. They might not even have a computer. Hopefully most of them do. Hopefully most or some of them are savvy enough that they can receive emails and respond. So you could do email surveys. You can do some kind of online survey in addition to what you're doing. You want to try to solicit as much information from the community as often as you can. And I get it, without overwhelming them. But, you know, there is no absolute answer to that. I wish there was, but it's from my opinion, it's a multimedia approach. Hope that's helpful. Can everyone see, Crystal, can you see this on your screen?
Yes, I can.
Okay.
And Paulette, I know how like old school this can be, but mailers are a really great option too, because we also have dealt with that where, like, for example, this week our staff is over at USET, and there's a lot of people who preferred to fill out their contact information on pen and paper, the good old school way. Meanwhile, we've kind of moved to a digital format, and there's nothing wrong with either. So if you have that ability, I definitely recommend that as well. And obviously put off a cutoff date and so on and so forth, or maybe include it in the next round of assessments or anything like that. And then yeah, I think we're definitely moving into that digital era where now everything's online or via email. But I saw your comment on the Zoom. I definitely recommend that too, especially if you can. Any way that you can make it accessible is important, I think, in my opinion.
Absolutely. Thank you, Crystal. So we're going to move in. Here's the first slide of the first PowerPoint presentation. First slide. Want to get in, just as I said, we're going to be touching on 10 key items and community involvement, as we just had a quick conversation about. Also, program identification. That's part of, what are you trying to do? Hopefully, this is where the community would come in, or your leadership, to tell you what is it, what's important, what are the priorities of the tribe, of the organization, of the TDHE. What are you trying to accomplish here? And then also establishing the project team, and then also, as I mentioned, leveraging resources. The course, as you probably know, is the fundamentals of solid grant writing and guidance on how to make your grant proposal stand out. But as I mentioned before, being able to write a good narrative, to get to that point, you need to have a solid understanding of the fundamentals of what needs to be put in place to develop it. In other words, kind of jump ahead here. How can you describe the needs of your organization? And that's an important part of a grant proposal. A grant narrative is to be able to describe the needs of the organization. How can you describe the needs of the organization if you don't have some kind of input from leadership, from the community, telling you clearly what is important for your tribal entity? Is it housing? Is it a multi-facility community center? Is it infrastructure? What is it exactly that you're trying to do? It's impossible for you to describe the needs, which is what a funder is going to be looking for, to be able to understand what your needs are. It's also going to be impossible for you to describe how you're going to accomplish those needs and how you're going to do it methodically if you don't understand the fundamentals of how to get there in the first place. So I kind of jumped ahead there to give you kind of an understanding of a little more understanding of where we're going with this. The fundamentals of grant writing, the universal approach, it takes a village approach to grant proposal writing. So that's what we're going to try to do. Here's another way to look at it. Here are the objectives, what I'm going to do in this particular section. Get a better understanding of the role of the grant writer. Also, how to effectively, more efficiently. I wish there was a quick answer to this, but the process in 2A here of soliciting information from the community without burning them out, as was just mentioned, for initiatives and goals and a better understanding of where to go as a grant writer, and also developing the project team and the resources. And then later, as you can see, number 4, 5, and 6, Number 4, we'll do a little bit later. That's the analysis, the SWOT analysis, strength, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. Get into goal development. And then 5 and 6 is navigation. And then lastly, the creating the strong narrative. So here's just another way to look at the grant cycle. We're at the top of the page there, the community involvement and program identification, which moves over to the right of the screen, establishing the project team. Those are the 2 big things we're going to talk about this morning and early afternoon, and then finish over in that last green box over there. It's kind of a very light tint to it because we're not there yet, but that is really the goal of this training this afternoon, is for you to be able to accomplish that, what's in that green box. Organize, write, and package the proposal based on the fundamental concepts that you've learned from 10 a.m. this morning until 2:30 p.m. this afternoon on the basics of what. And let me tell you one thing too that I know is important.
Vince,
Yeah.
sorry, really quick. You need to
Yeah.
hit play, because right now we're seeing it as if you're editing it. So we're not on.
I see it as a full screen.
We don't.
I see it as a full screen.
We do not.
You see it as a draft version,
Yes.
a workable version. I don't know how to correct that.
Do you have multiple monitors?
No, single.
Why don't we hit
stop?
Yeah, let's hit stop sharing.
Stop sharing. Okay.
Go ahead and share again.
Are you with me, people?
Yes, give us just a second, guys and gals.
Okay, it's not there. I'm gonna have to minimize this and bring it back up. There it is. Okay. Beginning. Okay. No, I'm having a hard time getting it. Let's see. I have it on my screen.
When you present, you have to present from the shared screen that that you're presenting on. You can't minimize one screen and then pull up another.
Yeah.
If that makes any sense.
Yeah.
And right now, all we're seeing is black.
Okay. Open.
We had something for a second.
Is that up?
Okay. Yeah, now press play from beginning.
Thunder? It's full screen on my system.
It's not for us though. Can you click play from beginning?
It is. Play from beginning.
Okay, go to the bottom right and you see next to the scaling, like where you can zoom in and out. There's one that looks like a little screen, like one that you would pull down. The one all the way to the right. But before you would zoom in. A little bit more to the left.
Slideshow.
No, there, click, yeah. No, we don't need to zoom in. We just need you to press the button that's next to zoom on the left. I don't know why it's not. There we go.
Here?
You had it.
I had it.
Uh-huh. There we go.
Here?
Yep. And then you can go ahead and advance to where you were
That's where I
talking.
was, right there, grant cycle.
There we go.
Okay. Thank you, everyone. Thank you for bearing with me.
Yes,
We get
thank you,
through this.
everyone.
Here we go. Okay, you saw this. I talked about this. So let's get into the very first thing here, and that is I want to make sure that everyone, I'm sure you know this, but I'm going to reiterate it. What is a grant? A lot of people think that a grant is free money, and that's really not the case. A grant is not free. Nothing's free. You know, if you can look at it that way, nothing is free. Is it a gift? I would argue that grants are really an investment. They're not a gift. They're not free money. They are an investment from some entity, usually a funder, to a recipient. So whether that's you as in receiving the Indian Housing Block Grant or the ICDBG or any other type of federal grant or the Indian Housing Block Grant, you are a recipient, and the grant that you're receiving is an investment by some organ, by somebody or something. And all organizations that give you an investment are looking for what's referred to, without even saying, they may not put it in this terms, but what they're really looking for is for you to use that investment to the best of your ability and what it was designed for. They are looking for what's referred to in the banking industry as a return on investment, or an ROI, return on investment. So that kind of makes us it's a good way to look at. I think it's a very positive, and it makes us fiduciarily responsible for the grant that we are receiving. And fiduciary means we have a financial obligation to make sure that the funding that we're receiving is considered an investment, and that we were doing everything within our power to make sure that the investment is being used the way it's designed to be used, the way it's supposed to be used to meet your needs of the organization. So, you know, it's just a more serious approach to grant writing. It's just, and this is where, again, I refer back to it takes a community to do grant writing and to put this whole thing together. If you look at grants as an investment rather than a gift, rather than a given, then I think you have a much better viewpoint of your responsibility. So that's important. And always, always remember that somebody or something is looking for return. What is that grant money being used for, and is it being put to good purposes? And it's going to be our job to not only describe accurately and persuasively what that money is going to be used for, but then after the fact, to be able to report on it properly. And that's more of the grant management side of the equation, which is a whole nother training. That's next week when we get into grants management. But we're laying the foundation, right? We're putting the preliminary things together to be able to set up our team to make sure that the grant that we hopefully will receive is treated properly as an investment. And if it's federal money, then it's taxpayer money. So even more importantly, the money that we're using to fund our program, either in real time or hypothetically, is something that we're going to treat as we would treat our own money and our own investments. So it's not free money. It's really not even a gift. It's an investment. So just keep that in mind as we go through the several hours that we have training here. The investment of grant funding as opposed to the gifts or the free money that's out there. Don't ever fall into the trap. You see this sometimes. Free money, free grant money. Nothing is free. There's always going to be a catch. There's always going to be strings attached. There's always going to be rules and regulations and protocols that we have to abide by, whether they are external and put upon us or internal that we have to put in place. There's always going to be protocols and regulations and citations. More on that later. And again, if you're interested in that level, the after the fact, the reporting and processing and all those responsibilities, join me next week when we get into that session. More on that later, but let's get back to the presentation here. 10 key items. If you're new to grant writing or never been in it before, as I mentioned, you're in the right place. And let's talk about 10 key items for new grant writers. From my viewpoint, having done this for 20 years, small, medium, and large grants over the years, and also the research of best practices out there. Very first thing, know who your audience is, know your community. As the comment came in just a few moments ago, talking about soliciting the community, the more you know about them, the more you know about their weaknesses and their strengths and what their demands are, the better off you're going to be. And the more you can solicit information from them through the multimedia approach that I was alluding to, the better off you're going to be. Know your community, know its needs, do your research to the best of your ability to determine what that need is. Call upon others where you can to try to get an understanding, if you don't have it already, what the community is. Also, you can interchange the word community with leadership, whether it's a tribal council, whether it's a board of directors or board of commissioners. If you're a TDHE, for example, tribally determined housing entity, know who your leadership is, know who your community is, and what their needs are to the best of your ability, because that's really where your marching orders come from. Leadership in the form of commissioners, directors, tribal council, or community at large. So the more you understand and the more that you are empowered to be able to solicit that information, the better off you're going to be. What do I mean by that? What I mean is grant writing is also a series of teachable moments. You have to be able to communicate with your leadership, whether it's your boss or your boss's boss, your colleagues, your subordinates. You need to be able to communicate with them and convince them in one way or another that you need to be, as the grant person, the grant contact, the grant writer, you need to be empowered to be able to get information from all of the operating departments of the tribe and the community. You need to be able to have access to information. You need to be able to have access to people. You need to be able to have an opportunity to present information to your colleagues and to your leadership and to the community. So you need to be empowered to be able to do that and have the wherewithal and the ability to follow through on that. You cannot be an island and be a grant writer. You have to be a more gregarious. You have to have the empowerment to be able to talk to people, to have access to information. Not that you're going to delve into private information or proprietary, but you need to be able to have access. And your leadership needs to understand that, because as the grant writer, you need to be able to solicit information, as I mentioned, from the community, from leadership, from subject matter experts that might be within your organization or outside your organization. So your hands cannot be tied. You cannot be that island that does not have access to this type of information. And if you have your hands tied in one way or another now, figuratively or literally, you need to be able to communicate that with your leadership and convince them through teachable moments that you need access to information as the grant writer. Otherwise, your ability will be stymied. It will be limited. You need to mitigate that. You need to be able to convince, you need, as it says there at the bottom, you need to be able to have access to program information, general operating information. You need access to people and to programs. That is part of it. How in the world are you going to be able to put together, to orchestrate a grant application for an important program or project if you don't have access to all the different departments and all the different information and the leadership? You need to be able to coordinate that. Look at yourself, look at it as two different ways. Look at yourself either as an orchestra conductor. You've all been to orchestras, maybe even played in an orchestra when you were a kid, or you went to an orchestra. The orchestra conductor is familiar with all the instruments, right? Probably knows how to play some of them, if not most of them. Has a great understanding. May not be an expert on any one given instrument, but understands all the instruments of the orchestra and how they fit and work together, and understands the music when it comes together, right? He or she is the leader and is able to understand all the different components and has the ability to work with all those individual instruments and the sounds that come with them to be able to put them together. That's what a grant writer is, an orchestra leader. It also, from a different perspective, the orchestra leader or the grant writer is also the quarterback of the team, being able to call the signals, being able to bring the other 10 players together to be able to put together a play, an offensive play, not only offensively, but able to understand defensive plays as well, to be able to put together an offensive play that's going to work with a defense, right? So the quarterback has to be able to, like the orchestra conductor, has to be able to understand all the different positions and or instruments and or positions, and understand the role that each position plays, and then be able to put it together in an action, right? That comes to some conclusion. The conclusion for the orchestra is beautiful music. The putting it together for the football team is a completed pass or running play or defensive play or whatever, or touchdown ultimately, right? So look at it from two different perspectives. That is what a grant writer's role is, the equivalency of that, and there's other things too. A third perspective would be a chef in a major restaurant. The chef, the chief chef, understands all the different components, right? Understands what the sous chef does, understands what the cook line does, understands what's referred to as the back of the house, the front of the house, understands everything to be able to put together a delicious meal, right? Same thing here, is being able to understand the role that you play. But what's important about each one of those three, the orchestra conductor, the football quarterback, or the chef, what's the most important thing? Access to information and the wherewithal, and also the ability, what's the word I'm looking for? I used it a moment ago. The giving the opportunity to be able to call upon all the different assets, whether they're instruments, whether they're plays, or whether they're cooking utensils or food items, being able to put it all together to come up with a finished product. So subject matter experts could be in the form of an oboe player or a bassoon player or a trumpet, or they could be a tight end or a running back or a defensive tackle, or the third scenario could be the sous chef or the particular line cook or the host or hostess, etc. See what I mean? It's being able to understand the role that you play as the point person for your organization and being able to tap into all those different resources. So soliciting the community or your leadership for information is just part of the big picture. It's having the wherewithal and having the empowerment. That's the word I'm looking for again. The empowerment, the given empowerment to tap in to all those resources and bring it all together. Community is just one part of it because they provide you with the information of what's important in the big picture. But from there, we go into, as I mentioned, understanding the mission, the major objectives, the goals. That's what the community can and the leadership can provide you. And number two here is what I'm talking about. The orchestra conductor, the quarterback, the chef needs to understand the mission of the organization, whether it's a football team, whether it is an orchestra or a jazz band, whether it is a fine dining establishment. The conductor, the quarterback, and the chef need to understand what the organization's mission is. Very, very clearly understand that mission and hopefully be able to solicit major initiatives. What is important for the group? What are the goals of the group? Whether the group is an orchestra, a team, or a restaurant. Same thing for grant writers. Look at it that way. And this is maybe some of the language of the teachable moments that you can present to others within your organization. You are the orchestra leader. You are the quarterback. You are the chef. You're coming in, you need to understand the mission and everything. The second sentence there. Keep in mind that everything is based on the organization's mission. This gets particularly important when you start providing or potentially providing products and services. You've got to make sure that any service that you provide or any product that you might sell is tied back to the mission. This is critically important for nonprofit organizations because the whole idea of a nonprofit is to be able to be classified as a nonprofit organization by the IRS, right? And to avoid corporate level taxes and to be categorized by the IRS as a for-profit organization. So as a nonprofit, the mission of the organization when it comes to products and services is critical. You don't want to do something that could be misconstrued to be something that a for-profit organization can do. So the point I'm making here is basically that. Understand the mission and the objectives of the organization. Okay, let's just focus on that. The mission and the major initiatives. The mission is usually pretty clear in most organizations, unless you're creating an organization from scratch, and that's a whole nother training program, how to start a nonprofit or how to start a small business. Most of the organizations are established, they have a mission and a vision. With that given, major initiatives change from time to time. It depends on the whims of the organization, right? On the whims of the community. Do they want a multimedia or a multi-usable training facility? Do they want infrastructure? Do they want, what is it that they want? So the major initiatives change. And sometimes the goals, well, not sometimes, if the major initiative changes, then the goals are going to change. No question. We'll get into that in more detail when we get into developing SMART goals using the logic model this afternoon. All right. As it says at the bottom of the screen, the goal for every major initiative should be developed in accordance with a logic model process, which I'll get into. And every goal that's developed must be in sync with the major initiatives that the entity wants to have, that the community wants to have. And of course, the major initiatives that the community wants to have must be in sync with the mission of the organization. Also, third, grant writers, know your organization's financial situation, its operations. No, you do not need to be a CPA. No, you do not need to be an auditor or a financial planner, but you do need to have access to information, not necessarily protected information, but information nonetheless on how the organization's financial structure operates. Because quite frankly, the fiscal and financial operations of your organization are going to play a big part, probably, most likely, in the grant that you're pursuing. I can tell you, 99 times out of 100, there's going to be some kind of a budget that is going to be submitted with your grant narrative. So you need to have the fundamentals not only of how budgets work and how financial operations and fiscal things. You need to have a better understanding of how the organization works and have the empowerment to be able to ask those questions if needed, to be able to understand how cash flows, if you're on an accrual system or a cash system. What are the accounts receivable, accounts payable? What is the balance statement? You need to have basic understanding of the financial operations, because middle sentence there, keep in mind that the internal controls for operation, for finance and accounting, for compliance must be established in one way or another, implemented and enforced. Particularly if you're receiving federal funding from a federal agency, there will be internal controls that you have to put in place for the tribe, for your department, for your TDHE. Everything is going to have internal controls. So do yourself a favor, if you haven't pursued this, get a better understanding of the financial operations of your organization, get a better understanding of how your organization operates as a whole, and get a better understanding of any compliance regulations that are put in place or need to be put in place based on the funding that you're pursuing. That's an important part of grant or pursuing grant opportunities. As I mentioned before, return on investment, right? The grant is an investment. The investor, the federal agency or the other philanthropic organization that's giving you that grant is going to demand in one way or another that you have internal controls in place, probably in the form of policies and procedures. So you need to understand what those stipulations are. If it's federal funding from any of the federal agencies, now my experience is more with HUD in the housing area in the Indian Housing Block Grant. And I can tell you, if you're receiving that funding, or basically any other type of federal funding, you're going to have federal compliance regulations that have to be put in place. The more you understand that process, the better off you'll be. Again, that is a discussion on grants management. Join me next week to talk about, as Crystal mentioned early on, those federal regulations, 2 CFR Part 200 Uniform Guidance and 24 CFR Part 1000, which is HUD's Native American Housing Activity.
Questions? Yes,
Yeah.
there are. So we have Clifton Ellis, who was looking to ask a question about major initiatives. So Clifton, if you want to go ahead and unmute really quick.
Yes, I just understand the goals and just trying. Sometimes the goals can be, or the major initiatives can be part of the goals. Is that, say, like infrastructure? It may not be something for a program, but it may be an overall need for the tribe as a whole. Is that what you're kind of pointing on major initiatives?
Yeah, that's a good question, and I'll get to that in more depth early this afternoon. But I can tell you right now, a quick answer would be, yeah, every organization's going to have a mission. That's usually established long ago. That's the big picture. That's the missions don't change very often. But what does change from time to time are major initiatives, whether it be, and I'm just giving hypothetical examples when I talk about uh, infrastructure or community facility or housing units. Those are all major initiatives. And every major initiative is going to have a series of goals, which are the equivalent of small steps, baby steps. The goals are in sync with the initiative. The initiative is in sync with the mission of the organization. Mission doesn't change. The mission always stays the same, at least in my understanding. It's the major initiative that might change from year to year and the goals that come with it. But bear with me, be a little patient. We'll get into that in more details later this afternoon when I get into more details on initiatives and goals. But that's a short answer. Hopefully that helps.
Great, thanks.
Great. And then you also have Paulette. Paulette, go ahead and unmute really quick and ask your question.
Okay, as a TDHE, are we, because we work with like 10 other villages, do we ensure that they're in compliance with and then they're on their policies and procedures, because we apply for the block grants on their behalf when we're building in their community?
Yeah, if you're collaborating with other tribal entities and you're sharing funding, or you're receiving funding on behalf of other entities, they in fact become kind of a sub-recipient of you. So that kind of puts you in the driver's seat of being responsible for making sure that your policies and procedures are in line with what they should be and that you're enforcing them, and that the others that are receiving funding from you through that funding source are also in compliance. So,
So
yeah.
we would, they're like the pass through. So
Yeah,
we're
yeah,
writing the grant on their
yeah,
behalf. They're receiving the money, but it's being passed through to us.
yeah, yeah. And that makes you the pass-through entity, that makes you responsible for receiving the money, it makes you responsible for making sure that all the internal controls and policies and procedures are in place for yourself and for the recipients, the sub-recipients, in this case, the other tribal entities. So yeah, what you're describing sounds like you need to have not only your internal controls in place, but also monitor to make sure that they're spending the money appropriately on their end, since the money's flowing through you. Is it
It's
Indian
actually
housing? Is it
flowing
Indian
from
housing
the,
block? Is
it's
it Indian
actually,
housing block grant money?
yeah, it's actually flowing from them to us.
They are the recipients, and you
Yeah, they would be the recipient and we're the subrecipient.
Okay. Yeah, say okay, role reversal. They are responsible for receiving the money and making sure that the internal controls are there, and you're the sub-recipient. You also need to communicate with them and make sure that your internal controls, your policies and procedures are in sync with the federal regulations. In
Okay.
particular, when it comes to Indian Housing Block Grant, you want to make sure that your internal controls match up with what's in the 2 CFR Part 200 Uniform Guidance. You want to make sure
Okay.
of that, and the 24 CFR Part 1000. The
Thank you.
housing. Yep, you're welcome. Good
Beautiful.
questions. Really good questions.
And that's it
Okay.
for right now, Ben. So you're good to
Okay.
go.
Okay, thank you, Crystal, because I can't see the questions. I see a full screen um, of the presentation and not the questions. So thank you.
Absolutely.
Develop a rapport goes without saying. The rapport is everything that I've been describing, having the ability, having the access to information and to people, building a rapport, the teachable moments that I was talking about before. With staff, stakeholders would be basically anyone that's involved in the decision-making process, whether it's your leadership, whether it's the community. Having a rapport with them is important to be able to educate them on the role that you play. So it takes a village, exactly. And you are the orchestra conductor, you are the quarterback, you are the chef, you're the one that needs to have a communication and build relationships with your subject matter experts and with your leadership, with your subordinates, with outside organizations to the best of your ability, because it pays off in the end. A lot of times you've heard it's a cliche. A lot of times it's who you know. You've heard that expression. It's not what you know. Sometimes it's who you know. And on a positive spin on that, taking advantage of building rapport with everyone is a good thing to the best of your ability. Or having someone within your team that is able to do that on your behalf to build those relationships. Because you need to have that. You need to pull in different subject matter experts and different decision makers from time to time. And it takes a village. You need to get out there. You need to communicate not only the position you play, but the importance of what a grant writer is to the organization, you know, as the conductor, as the quarterback, as the chef, of putting this all together, being able to bring in those resources, whether they're instruments, whether they're positions on a team, or whether they're food products and processes within a kitchen. You need to bring it all together to be able to create an end product. Same thing with the grant writer. Have a system in place. You know, a lot, you know, we just mentioned Indian Housing Block Grant, IHBG. A lot of that is pretty straightforward. But the more you need to know that if you're a housing entity or TDHE and you're receiving the Indian Housing Block Grant funding, or basically any other federal funding, you're going to fall under the regulations of 2 CFR Part 200, also called Uniform Guidance. It's also called the Super Circular. That's kind of its street name, Super Circular. It's been around now for a number of years. It's a consolidation of several regulations from the past that they put together in one comprehensive form. The more you're familiar with that document, the better off you're going to be, because that program, that regulation in particular, 2 CFR Part 200, tells you, if you're the recipient of federal funding, that document tells you what is an allowable cost and what is not allowed. It also provides a description of compliance and of procurement, and how you need to have competition in your procurement system. If you're interested in more details on that specific, on the uniform guidance on 2 CFR Part 200, there are some webinars that the NLC has on that in its archive. You can go to the nativelearningcenter.com. You can go into Catheta online, which is the link to all the webinars, the new webinars coming up and the archive webinars. And you can go in there and search for grant management. That's where you'll find more details on those regulations. What I'm talking about here is being able to have a system in place. Everything I've been describing to now, everything, that's the system that you need to have in place. And also being able to have a system for obtaining, storing, retrieving information and data and access to people that can be used in the grant application. That's what I've been talking about. That's the village concept. That's the teachable moment. Being able to convince others. It's wonderful to be the grant writer. I think it's a great position, but you need to be able to convince leadership that it's a unique position too. You need access to information. Otherwise, your hands are tied. Keep in mind that federal funders require grant recipients, such as you, to safeguard personally identifiable information. If you have not heard of that, it's referred to as PII, and it's in the regulations. It's in that 2 CFR Part 200 uniform guidance. It's in there. It's part of the universal controls. Write this down, 2 CFR Part 200.303 and 2 CFR Part 200.302. Those two citations within the uniform guidance talk about the internal controls and the financial controls that are needed. And in that same area, you'll find information on what's referred to as PII, personally identifiable information, which is private information on your clientele, whoever your clientele are. With the Native Learning Center, their clientele are instructors, because all they do is training. Okay, so it's a little different. But with housing entities, your clientele obviously are the renters or owners of your facilities, and PII is the personal information that they provide to the housing entity about themselves and their family. And that could be a myriad of data and information, from marriage status, social security number, passport numbers, criminal background record, driver's license numbers, marital status, all kinds of different things. When you start putting that together, you have personally identifiable information that needs to be protected. But you also need perhaps to have access to some of that information to be able to know who your clientele is. So that is important. to know. Okay. Being able to write a full proposal. This is just a prelude to what we're going to talk about this afternoon. There are the 7 components that we're leading up to of writing a narrative. We're going to talk about these 7 things, but before we get there, we need to understand the fundamentals. This is actually, this is from an orchestra conductor, from a quarterback, from a chef standpoint. This is the final product that a grant writer needs to be able to pull together using his or her subject matter experts. They need to be able to put together some kind of a summary, usually done last, but that, the summary that describes the whole thing, the whole grant that you're pursuing. Also be able to articulate what the need is, very, very important. 3, measurable goals. We've dropped that word several times now, goals. I'm going to get into that in more depth, but being able to establish goals that are attainable and measurable, that's critical. Have a plan of action. In other words, what are you going to do? If you can explain what the need is and what the goals are, how are you going to put it all together? How are you going to mix the ingredients? How are you going to blend those instruments together? How are you going to use your offensive line and your running backs to make the play work? What is your plan of action? Then being able to, 5 says evaluation and measure of success. You cannot accomplish number 5 or describe it if you can't define it in number 3. And you can't define number 3 if you don't know what number 2 is, right? So look at it as a math equation. You cannot, there are prerequisites here. That's a way to look at it, is prerequisites. You've got to have a need before you can establish goals. You've got to have goals before you can evaluate your goals and measure your success. And a lot of funders want to know through some kind of reporting mechanism where you are a month, 6 months, a year, 5 years, whatever, down the road. They want to be able to find out from you where their return of investment is, where they stand. They gave you money. Where are you with your progress? And you cannot, that's number 5. You cannot do that or describe it or answer that question unless you have number 3 in place. So that's where we're going here. And then number 6 is what's referred to sustainability or capacity. No funder wants to be the sole provider of your funding in perpetuity. They want to know that you're able to resource other, be able to use and identify and use other resources, not just them. So this is very, very important, being able to have the capacity to have long-term funding. You need to look at your sustainability over the short term and over the long term. That's what number 3 will also help you. And number 5 will help you to define number 6, your sustainability in the long term. And then you need to be able to put the real numbers together that are transparent, and you need to be able to describe that in your narrative, what your budget is, what the monies that are needed and that are going to be used and for what. Of course, you can't do the budget if you don't know what your need is and you don't know what your goals are and you don't know what your plan is. You cannot accomplish number 7. So these are all prerequisites. These are all part of the proposal. And they might have different names on different grants, but basically every single grant, whether it's a grant from a federal agency or on the private side from a corporation or from a community center or from a private individual, every single grant is going to ask you for this type of information. So you have to be able to understand this from the get-go, be able to understand this and put the information that you're soliciting and creating into these blocks here, into these buckets. So you can actually put this all together at the end and write your narrative based on real accurate information. I hope that makes sense. This is what you're seeing on the screen basically is the ultimate. That's what we're trying to do, is be able to write the full proposal every single time and have a skill set in our mind that this is how we formulate these different things. So when the community comes to you, or when your leadership comes to you and says, hey, write a grant for a community center, you automatically think of this matrix. How are we going to get there? How are we going to, what is the need, first of all? There's probably a need, because I don't think they'd come to you with anything, that's unreal. It could be unrealistic, but there must be some kind of a need that can be defined, and then goals that are established. If you cannot articulate a need for a particular objective, like a building facility or infrastructure, if you cannot define the need or create goals for it, then it's not an objective. It's a dream. It's just a dream, a wish. So this is what we're trying to do. These are the buckets that we're trying to establish for grant writers. Tracking system goes without saying, not only have access to information, but be able to track the information pre-grant, which is basically what this training is, pre-grant, and post-grant, that's grants management, being able to track information after the fact. You never want to be in a situation where you say, oh my God, we got the grant, now what do we do? We don't know how to do this. That should be totally avoided. And that's part of what this training is, and part of what next week's training would be on post-grant requirements. So join me for that. Relationship with funders, I talked about that. And understand, here's a good one, understanding the funders world. And that's kind of what I've been talking about, that maybe not in specific terms, but the return on investment, of course, is one very important aspect of a funder's perspective, right? They want to know that the money being used for a given project, a given initiative, is being used successfully. That's what this system helps you to define that. And we want to understand that second sentence there. Keep in mind that grants are the investments, and that the funders, even if they're federal agencies or whether they're corporate entities, communities, or private foundation, like the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, for example, the largest foundation in the world with billions of dollars of assets, they're still going to want to know, even if they only give you $1,000 or even less, they're going to want to know, what are you using this money for? It's an investment on our part, even though it's a small one. They're going to want to know what the money's used for. We need to keep that in mind as grant developers, grant writers, that we always need to understand the perspective of the funder, where that money is coming from, who it's coming from, what are their conditions, what are they looking for in this whole process. Okay. And lastly, hopefully, if it's not overwhelming, if it hasn't been overwhelming so far, enjoy what you're doing. It's not easy doing this. It's not easy to be a grant writer. Be proud of what you're doing. It's a lot. It takes a village to put this together. As I mentioned, there's a lot of moving parts here. There's a lot of teachable moments. There's a lot of things that need to come together. And the orchestra leader, the quarterback, the chef, you as the grant writer, you all play the same role. You are the leader, the pack leader, so to speak. You need to bring it all together. So you need to understand people, you need to understand the product, you need to understand the tribe, you need to understand the operation of your tribe, or at least have access to that information, and do the best to learn those things, because all of that comes together. Grant writing, and as I showed you too, it also involves internal control. So there's going to be a fair amount of being able not only to write the grant, which I'll get into a little bit later. The grant writing is more of storytelling and persuasiveness, right? Grant writing is not much more than writing a story, where internal controls, policies, and procedures are technical writing. So good grant writers should be able to segue between both of those type of writing styles. persuasive writing, which is the hallmark of grant writing, and then technical writing, which is the way that internal controls and policies and procedures. More on that when we get into it, more on that. Okay, you've been asking questions as we go along, and I want to take the remaining 40 minutes here to go in to talk a little bit more about community involvement. Let's keep going. Again, ask questions where you think they're important. I'll do my best to answer them. I'll move through this because we talked about community involvement already. Process, you know, here, community involvement. There's a lot of different things. We want to, from the left here, involve and support, strong planning capacity. Hopefully they have an idea of, you know, what's important to the community. They give you, if not the goals, at least some kind of initiative. See, I put initiatives at the top of the pyramid. The community provides what the major initiative is, you know, whether it's infrastructure or housing, you know, new housing units or rehab of housing units, or a multi-usable facility for elders and youth and veterans and that type of thing. That's the major initiative in my mind. It's at the top of the pyramid. And directly below that, sometimes below that, are the goals that have to be put in place. And a lot of times this is where the grant writer and the grant project team has to come in to make interpretations of the initiative to create goals. I'll show that in more detail when we move into SMART goal development. So realistic goals, multiple approaches to achieve those goals. I just alluded to that in the last slide, talking about approaches to, you know, achievement. Strong organizational and management capacity, talked about that, had an understanding of how the organization works. On the top right, descriptions of project concept. You know, it's one thing to get a, you know, this is where we're trying to go. If the community is providing some information on what the major objectives are for them, what's important for them, hopefully they're able to define what that is in a little more detail. If not, then it's something that the grant process might have to work upon. And geographical information would be good. Systems of overcoming obstacles would be good if we can. These are some of the things, if we can pull this information out of the community. I know this is big picture. This would be wonderful if we could pull all of these things out of the community involvement, or at least a few of them, or one or two of them. Systems of accountability, any partnerships that are real or potential out there. In other words, with the partnerships, the community might say, we want that multi training facility put up on the reservation. We want that done, and we already have this wonderful relationship with the Boys and Girls Club, for example. So that could be a partnership that would fit in well, not so much with the construction, but with the operation of perhaps of the of the facility. So that's just one potential partnership or collaboration, a Boys and Girls Club or Boy Scouts and Girl Scouts, or a fitness center that already exists and they're looking for a new home. Maybe they could be part of the operation. That's what I mean by partnerships. Or some other agency out there that's interested in seeing that type of facility built, if part of it can be made accessible to the community at large, not just the tribal community, but to the bigger community at large. Maybe that's a potential partnership with the city or the county or the state or whatever. You know, maybe some of those partnerships are already established. So that maybe, and then maybe that's something the community can share. If not, then that might be something that the grant writer or the grant writing team has to work with to establish those partnerships. All right. Community involvement. I've talked about a lot of this already. Step 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. I talked a lot about step 1. Community involvement's important. That's a given. Comprehensive planning. We talked about that. That's you know, the more comprehensive information that can come from the community or our leadership, the easier our job is as the grant writer and the putting the grant writing team, project team together. So that's what we're trying to solicit from the community as much as possible. Step one, involvement, that's step one. Hopefully we can accomplish that. Step two, start to get information from them on what's important. That's step two. Step three, if it can be done with the community, if you can bring it to that level, is start breaking those big initiatives down. If they can do that, that's wonderful. That's one less step that the grant writing effort doesn't have to do. But step 4 and 5 is starting to get drilled down and getting even more specific. Project planning is probably something the community is just not going to be involved in that level of design. That's probably going to be left to a special team of maybe architects, engineers, and some other small group of leadership. The grant writing project team needs to be involved in it nonetheless, right? They need to keep tabs on what is happening, even if it's a separate subgroup, to make sure that progress on that major initiative in step 4 in project planning, let's say it's an architect, an engineer, and a couple tribal board members getting together to talk about project planning. You need to understand where that's going if you're going to be responsible for putting together the grant for this project. Step 5 is the ultimate step, the actual application, and then step 6 is the implementation. That's grant management. That's the neck. That's the hand. That's passing the baton off to the grant managers after the fact, after the money, after the investment, the grant comes in. But those are the 6 steps in a nutshell of community involvement. At least that's what we want to hopefully get out of good community involvement. The more the steps, the higher we go here, the more information. Step 1 is a given. We want community involvement. Just getting them together satisfies step 1. Step 2 is getting them to make some kind of input, some kind of commitment that this is important to this community. So even step 2 is at the lowest level. If you can get your community to at least give you a comprehensive planning in step 2, then you've accomplished more than most. Step 3 might be, step 3, 4, 5, and 6 might be pushing it for a community. That's getting into the details. So if you're going to draw a line, probably under step 2. Step 1 is a given. You're definitely going to get the community involved, whether you give giveaways, as it was mentioned a moment ago, food, beverage, and giveaways, whether you do it multimedia approach, do the community involvement. If you can get to the comprehensive planning and get some feedback from them, that's great. Or at least they're telling you what's important in the big picture to the community. 3, 4, 5, and 6 are probably going to be more detail oriented and probably something that specialized teams are going to have to work on, including the grant writing team. Your involvement's critical. All right, this is just going over step 1, 3, 4, 5, and 6, and everything. I kind of, I'm going to go through them to see if I missed anything. Community involvement, multimedia approach, community meetings, needs surveys, interviews with elders and tribal leaders. I didn't mention that specifically. Focus groups, steering committees, if you can get any of those groups. It's a multimedia approach for community involvement. These are just some of the approaches. Comprehensive planning, I talked about that. If you can get to this level, you're beautiful. You're getting their community actually agreeing on something and telling you something that's important to them as a whole. That's wonderful, because from there, wheels can start turning. Once they get to this level, giving you this information, and hopefully you don't have to do this with your team. If the community can provide you this, wonderful. And as I mentioned before, now we're getting into higher level details. Here's a quick look at goal development. Now, the question came up a moment ago, goals and initiatives. I said at the top of the pyramid, we have the initiatives, right? That's going to be the major focus area. Like when the community or your leadership comes to you and says, we want to have, well, in this case, an education program online. Here's the example. That's one of the major initiatives. Great. The community said we need to have some kind of virtual training program in place for the community at large. This is a new scenario. This is different than the community center, different than the infrastructure. This is education for adults, training initiative. Now, that's the major initiative. Wonderful. Clapping of hands. Great. The community, your leadership agreed. That's what we want to do. Now we get into some of the nitty gritty. This is where the rubber meets the road. How to answer the question, how are we going to get there? How are we going to put this in place? That's what step 3 is, goal development. So here's a snapshot. Look at it. We'll get into more detail, but I want to show you goal development using a logic model system looks something like this. There in the middle of the first bullet there, having an initiative. In this case, the initiative you can see at the bottom of the screen, far left, education, virtual training in this hypothetical example, right? That's the initiative. That came from the community. We're rolling with that. How do we break it down? Every initiative needs to have some kind of measurable goal, attainable, realistic, tangible, measurable. So in this hypothetical example, the first goal, the only one I've given here as an example, is to provide 6 webinar sessions in, let's say, well, that says 21, but let's make it fiscal year 2022. That's just one goal. And that seems realistic. You know, we're going to do 6 webinars on a given topic on education. Now, to make the goal even more realistic, you need to be able to measure it. There needs to be some kind of outcome. You can see at the bottom of the screen, it says outcome ST. That stands for short term. There needs to be some kind of outcome, a measurable, attainable, tangible something that's coming out of those 6 webinars as a goal, right? So in this hypothetical example, 6 webinars hopefully will generate 60 tribal members exposed to some kind of a training opportunity. The actual training is yet to be determined, but that would be hopefully a reasonable. That's what, basically 10 people attending per session for 6 sessions, or 60 members will be exposed to a training in the short term. Short term in this case could be like a 6-month period or a year. The result also needs to be measurable and attainable. The result would be something in the long term. Because we have a goal of the webinars, each webinar has a goal, an outcome projected. The result would be membership, in this hypothetical example, membership awareness will increase by 30%. So what we've created here, this little matrix that we created, is the concept of the logic model, where we give some kind of description, in this case, a tangible visual matrix of how we're going to take the initiative and at least break it down into one goal. Now, every initiative probably has more than one goal, probably has a whole bunch of goals, right? Not just one. The important thing to remember is even if it has 100 goals, even if that initiative, education virtual, has 100 little baby goals next to it, each goal needs to have an outcome, needs to generate something. The goal needs to be tangible, the outcome needs to be measurable, and then of course the result, which is based on the outcome, also needs to be measurable. If you cannot generate an outcome or a result from your goal, then you don't have a goal. You have a dream. And so every initiative, think about this for a minute, every initiative you need to think this way, every major initiative, whether it's a facility, whether it's education, whether it's infrastructure, whether it's anything, whether it's housing units, rehab, or new, needs to be measured in tangible goals. You need to be able to define, look at the goals as baby steps, right? They're baby steps. So there's a whole bunch of them that need to be lined up vertically here next to initiative. And each one needs to be measurable, attainable, so you can create an outcome. That's the way we need to think. That's what's referred to as the logic model process. So if someone comes to you and says, leadership says, we've been thinking about this and we want to create a 75-story building on the reservation for seniors. The first thing that should come to your mind is, How are we going to accomplish that? How are we going to break out the goals that are tangible? It seems unrealistic, and I can prove that, because how would you do such a thing? How would you get the permits to do such a thing? How would you literally put that into motion? What would the goals be? Because every goal needs to be tangible and measurable. Think of that process, this visual here, this matrix: initiative, goal, outcome, and result for everything that you need to do. This can be used, this concept here, we'll get into more detail in a minute, this afternoon, but this concept, goal development using the logic model process, can be used for grant writers. It can be used for strategic planning, right? Because you can develop a goal, then you can push it out. This, if you look at the matrix here, we're talking about short-term and long-term, probably within 1 year, but you could push that out to 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, 5 years, etc. So it's a good strategic plan tool. It's also good for staff or personnel goals internally. You give somebody an assignment to do a task, you need to have measurable goals, right? If you go to your bookkeeper and say, we need you to do this type of financial recording, we need you to take in all the accounts receivable and all the checks that come in and log them in this accounts receivable manual. That is an internal control, right? It also is a manageable goal. So everything, even internal jobs, can have this type of mechanism put in place. Keep this in mind, this concept in mind, when you're writing or developing or reviewing your internal controls that you need to have in place for your federal funding. You need to have this concept in line all the time, everything that you do. Being able to break down big nebulous ideas into real initiatives that are measurable and attainable through realistic goals, right? And that each goal is a measurable goal because it can be measured in the short term as an outcome and measured in the long term as some kind of change within the organization. Look at this matrix at the bottom from left to right. We're talking about change. This is a change mechanism. The initiative, it's got a goal, right? It's got an outcome in the short term, and the result, really, what that result, another word for it is percentage change within the organization. And what is the change? Membership awareness increase. That's a change in awareness. In this case, it's an increase. Now, if it were something a negative, like teen pregnancies, major initiative, reduce teen pregnancy or reduce opiates use on the reservation, or meth homes being converted into meth houses. Those are all reductions. The major initiative would be perhaps reduce the use of methamphetamines on the reservation. Huge initiative, right? How in the world do we get there? That's where our baby goals come into place. That's where we start breaking things down. But to get there, you have to understand the use of methamphetamines on campus and the need and the problem. But in a matrix, this is what it looks like. Major initiative: reduce the use of methamphetamines on the reservation within 5 years, let's say. Let's put a mark on it. Goal: that's going to be short-term stuff. That's going to be things that you can implement immediately that have an outcome and a result, a tangible, measurable result. I don't know. I'm not good on methamphetamines. I don't know much about drug usage. The point I'm making here is the result on the bottom right of the result of this would be not an increase, but a reduction of percentage, right? Reduction of membership awareness of methamphetamines would increase, and the use, hopefully praying that the use of methamphetamines would be reduced. That's what we're looking for in this scenario on that far right. Hope that makes sense. That's the logic model process that we use for grant writing and also carries over to strategic planning and other goals. Wherever there's a goal to be developed, where there's an initiative and a goal to be developed, even if it's with job reviews or, job description and responsibilities. The same things here. A lot of organizations are going to what's referred to as performance-based, and even grants are doing that too. Performance-based measures. The logic model that you see in front of you here is a performance-based tool, right? It's a performance-based tool. So whether you're talking about grant writing and trying to measure where you're going to be with your grant and your program, or whether you're talking about strategic planning, or whether you're talking about your personnel and the goals that they have in their jobs and their careers. This logic model concept, this is what you want to write down, the logic model process and the 4 components: initiatives, goals, outcome, and results. Well, people come to me and they say, this is a simple model. They say to me, we have outcomes that are more comprehensive than that. They're broken out. We have goals like you had, we have initiative and we have goals, but in a lot of cases we have outcomes that are in the short term and more long term. So we have a separate column in here, and that's fine. You can manipulate this matrix in any way, shape, or form you want. But the idea, this is a very simplistic version of it. The idea is the process. Once you have this thought process and this learned behavior as a grant writer, using the logic model process to break down any initiative and any goal, then you're golden. You can move through, you can use this anywhere. Like I like to say, it's not the program, it's the process that we're looking at here, the learned behavior, the mechanism, and that's what the logic model does. This is a huge, huge tool in grant writing, the logic model process for goal development, because it helps you do everything else. It helps you plan the project, it helps you with your application, which we've talked about, and it helps you obviously with the implementation. It also obviously helps you with your funder. Any questions so far on that? We still have about 15 minutes. And if it's okay with you, I'm going to finish up with the project team, talk a little bit about the project team, kind of get through that. I've already talked about the project team, but I'll kind of go through that. I might have to overlap leveraging resources to after lunch, but we'll see. All right, I talked about establishing the project team quite a bit. Depends, it's going to differ every time. You can't be a grant writer by yourself. We talked about that. You need to have other subject matter experts. So it depends on what the initiative is, right? If it's housing, you're going to have a different group of people. If it's infrastructure, you might have, again, different people. If it's education and training, again, a different group. It's going to flow. You need to be able to identify people within the organization and outside of the organization that are potential subject matter experts that can lend their input to your team, whatever it is. And the team needs to be flexible, give and take, depending upon what your focus is, what your initiative is. Talked about this just a moment ago, so I'm going to jump over that. Talked about project planning. This is just reiteration of the team. Oh, I'm sorry. Project planning, we talked about that. Step 1, making sure they understand this is the team, your subject matter experts. They understand what you're trying to do. They're like-minded. They know what you're going to do, what your mission is, what the initiative is, etc. Team members should select and represent, you need people from different backgrounds. Even if you're doing something specific like Indian housing block grant, you still need people outside the organization perhaps or within that have different levels of knowledge. For example, you can use Indian housing block grant at the bottom there for construction. You can use it for rehabilitation of housing, construction of housing. You better understand that you need to understand the Davis-Bacon legislation, and you need to understand the prevailing wage regulations that are in place. Or if the tribe has its own tribally determined wages, what those are for any given construction trade. So you need to have someone that understands construction. You need to have someone who understands Davis-Bacon, and prevailing wage. Very, very important, because if you spend over $2,000 of your Indian Housing Block Grant, or basically $2,000 of any federal funding on housing, on the construction or rehabilitation of housing, you're in Davis-Bacon territory. You're in prevailing wage territory, and prevailing wage will depend on the state that you're in and the county that you're doing your work in, and the trade that's working on the project, whether it's carpenters, plumbers, sheet metal mechanics, yeah, heavy equipment operators, crane operators, et cetera, et cetera. Each one has a different prevailing wage. Each wage is determined by the county that you're in and the state that you're in. So there's 3 different levels there in prevailing wage. And then Davis-Bacon has its own requirements on reporting process. Certified payroll records, for example. See where I'm going with this? You need someone who understands not only construction, but understands prevailing wage and Davis-Bacon legislation if you're using federal funding. Now, if you're using private dollars, you don't need the Davis-Bacon legislation. You don't need prevailing wage unless you're using union construction workers, a union GC. But other than that, you're good. Project management's going to change. Financial management, everything's going to have a financial component to it. Everything. And I mentioned before, you need to jot down the regulations, 2 CFR Part 200.302 and 303. So either one of those, 302 or 303, one of them is financial management. You need to understand the financial operations. You're obligated to have internal controls put in place, including policies and procedures that are in place for all of your financial management. So it behooves you to understand the operation from a fiscal standpoint, from a not just fiscal, but from a financial standpoint, including auditing, the audit, the program review, the back end of financial operation, of fiscal operation. If you're receiving more than $750,000, write this down if you like, $750K or more of federal funding, you're going to be required to have a single audit. And if you have subrecipients receiving funding through you, they are going to be included in that, and probably vice versa. If you're the subrecipient, as was mentioned a moment ago, of funding coming through another organization, you might be included in that audit to make sure that you're spending the money in regulation according to internal controls. So again, this all ties together, understanding the bigger picture. Financial management is one of the 3 legs of the stool. The other is compliance. And the third one is operation. Operation, compliance, financial management. All 3 of those, envision it as a stool. Those 3 legs hold up the stool, and sitting on top of that is your internal controls, right? So, envision that graphic there. You need to not only understand financial management as one leg of the stool, holding up your organization, but the other 2 as well. So even if you have a compliance person like the Native Learning Center used to have, me, everyone needs to understand what compliance is and how important it is and how it fits in with all of this structure, okay? That's all part of your internal controls. That's all part of grant writing, being able to understand that. Okay. Staff coordination comes with it. As the orchestra leader, as the quarterback, as the chef, as the grant writer, you're kind of responsible for figuring out, working with your team, working with leadership, who does what, who's on your team, first of all, and then who's going to be doing what. Who do you report to? This is important too. There needs to be communication from the top down and horizontally, of course. But from the top down, I mean, does the grant writer have responsibility communicating to a director or executive director, or directly to the TDHE's Board of Commissioners, Board of Directors, or directly to the Tribal Council, and vice versa? There needs to be information flowing back and forth. You need to identify who that or how that system works and what needs to be communicated, and if certain, and here's the important thing, if certain approvals are needed. Now, I know from experience that one tribe in particular, if they want to pursue grant funding, they need to have a couple things in place. One, they need to have it approved by the legal department. Even before that, it needs to be approved by the executive director. Then from there, it needs to be approved by a higher authority, in this case, the legal department. Then from there, after legal department approval, it goes to tribal council for approval in this case. Now, if you're a housing authority, TDHE, maybe it just simply goes from the grant writer to the executive director to the board of directors or board of commissioners, and that's it. But in other cases, it might have to go to council. You need to understand that process and the timeline. This is the important thing, the timeline associated with that. You got to work it backwards. If there's levels of approval, you need to know what they are. Also, you need to know what the other communication is from higher authorities that either aggravate or mitigate the situation. For example, some board of commissioners and some tribal councils might say, we don't want to pursue any grant that's less than, just pick a number, $25,000, because it's not worth the time and energy of the staff to put into it. Now, that's a hypothetical situation, but that could be a threshold that they say it's got to be. In other words, you can only pursue grant opportunities, no matter what the source is, more than $25,000 to make it worth our time to do it. Another one might be, we don't want you to pursue grant opportunities that have a matching component or leveraging component built in, which means that the tribe has to put in a certain percentage. If we're pursuing the $25,000, there might be a matching requirement that says the tribe has to put up 20% of the $25,000. So that obligates the tribe to put dollars in towards this to get money from the grant, and they might not want to do that. The third hypothetical scenario would be tribal commissioners or directors from a TDHE or tribal council might not want you to pursue grant opportunities where PII, privately protected information, has to be provided. In other words, the names, occupations, and maybe even the salaries and addresses of leadership, of council members or board of commissioner members. Maybe they don't want that information presented to the public. So that might be a stipulation. You need to know what those stipulations are, if any, and make sure you understand what leveraging means. Okay, so those are just a few. The process, there's examples, exactly what I said at the bottom there. It says most grants range from 5,000 to 30,000. That is typical on the private sector. If you're looking for grants, from corporations or from community centers, or from private foundations, that's your range. You're usually not going to see big dollars from those entities. I mentioned Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. They do give big, huge monster grants, millions of dollars, but their stipulation is one of two things. One, you have to be in the state of Washington State, or maybe even Oregon. Pacific Northwest, that's one stipulation they have. The other stipulation, which is the real hard one, the implications of the grant have to be global. In other words, if you're pursuing education, if you're pursuing medicine, which seems to be the two areas, they need to have global implementations worldwide. A lot of tribes, since we're domestic, don't do that, so you're probably not going to qualify for Bill and Melinda Gates, probably not going to qualify for a lot of foundation type awards in the private sector, because a lot of them are narrowed down into very specific things that don't relate to housing. Although if you're if you're pursuing for medical purposes, that might be an opportunity. But I'll get into that. That particular area we'll get into that when I start talking more about working through the online portals and looking for grant opportunities. That's this afternoon. All right, I'm going to finish up here see if there's any questions. And I talked about this. I'm just going to touch on it real quick. Skip over the slides a little bit because I talked about creating partnerships. Memorandums of understanding is taking the partnership to the next level. And that is getting, put it in writing type of thing. There's lots of, it's a good thing to have. If you want to work at the Boys and Girls Club as a, as a partner, as a potential partner in that facility scenario that I was talking about 20 minutes ago, having a memorandum of understanding would become very, very helpful, perhaps, in the grant process to show that, yeah, this organization is on board. They're going to help. They're going to, perhaps you might even be able to get some leveraging out of them in the way of volunteers, maybe even donations, use of equipment, etc. So partnerships taking to the next level and providing memorandums of understanding, referred to as MOUs, is a wonderful thing to have. You cannot have too many of these. And you always want to look for these type of things when you're pursuing any type of grant opportunity. They don't hurt and they show community involvement, community beyond tribal community. Then you want to be able to show that. I talked about partnerships, the relationships. I talked about this a little bit, why we need partners to generate resources that we might not have, basically, to increase our effectiveness, increase impact, to be more effective, eliminate duplication of services, for example, maybe, increase communication, expand services. Let me go back and eliminate duplication. You'd hate to, you want to avoid that. You're putting together that hypothetical example of a facility, multi-purpose facility, and you wanted to have a Boys and Girls Club in it, and then you find out that the county that you're going to put this in already has a Boys and Girls Club, and it's been there for 30 years. You don't want to duplicate the process. You want to eliminate duplication. That's when you reach out to them, perhaps, and you say, hey, do you want to work with us? We're building this brand new facility. You're in a storefront. Maybe we can collaborate. Maybe you can be housed in this program and have half of your services for tribal members and half for the community at large. And we will provide rent for you free of charge. There's all kinds of scenarios you can put in, and you put that in your memo of understanding, and you would eliminate a potential duplication of services. So my point is, partnerships are wonderful. Memorandums, putting it in writing and having some kind of a relationship does all of these things. It creates advocacy down at the bottom, creates building networks. It's great. Yeah, pros you can see, as I'm talking a lot about the pro side of it. The con is it takes time unless you've got something established. This is where your subject matter experts might be able to lend a hand. That's why when you bring in people as put outside of your organization, perhaps, that are subject matter experts, there's nothing wrong with bringing in professionals with community outside of the Native community, others that are professionals within given areas that might have access to some of these nonprofit organizations and some of these community organizations that might be beneficial, where you can align your goals and maybe come up with some kind of asset, some kind of partnership that could be leveraged within your grant. That's the ultimate idea, is to take these partnerships, these memorandums of understanding, even though they might be difficult to create them where you can and use them as leverage. In other words, try to convert them into tangible dollars that can be used in your grant application to show that we have the Boys and Girls Club coming in. We've invited them. They've been established for 30 years. They're going to come in this example. They're going to use our facility. They're going to provide service. That service is worth quite a bit of money to the community. When we put it all together and we add those services together, the savings to us is going to be substantial. It's going to be $1,000 a week. That's $52,000 a year projected, hypothetical here. That's leverage. that is something you could put in your grant application, perhaps, showing that we have this leverage. It's real. We have a memorandum of understanding, which makes it legitimate. It's with the Boys and Girls Club. And these are the services that we will be saving since we don't have to hire outside and pay these services. We're saving $52,000 a year on an anticipated cost of $60,000. So we're saving 95% of our costs in this area. That's what we're trying to accomplish with leveraging partnership, leveraging resources. So that's a hypothetical situation. Another one could be not, using equipment. Let's use the scenario of the infrastructure where we have to pave roads and we need heavy equipment. Maybe there's a local contractor who's not, might be a tribal member, maybe not, but we've struck up a relationship with this general contractor, earth mover contractor, and he is going to donate his dozer for plowing, leveling the land and being able to do all the basic land surveying and all that land, not the surveying, but the land movement. And that's worth about $50,000 right there for using that equipment and his services for that initial part of the construction phase. That's leverage. Memorandum of understanding from the contractors will make it legitimate, and then convert that into what it would, the value of it. That's your partnership, that's your leverage. That's something you can use perhaps in your grant if you're pursuing infrastructure, for example. Or if you're doing housing rehabilitation, maybe there's a GC out there that's willing to donate their rough carpenters, their carpenters to come in and do work. And it's going to give you a crew of 3 of them for a 3-week period to do housing construction, framing. And that's a huge value in itself. That's $15 an hour times fringe benefits at 30%. So we're up to $19 an hour times an 8-hour day times a 5-day week over a 3-week period times 3 people. So that's tens of thousands of dollars that can be used as leverage. That's another example. So the equipment, the workers, volunteers, Boys and Girls Club, all of those can be, and those are just off the top of my head, that could be used as leverage. That's what we're trying to do. We're trying to identify at all times and create successful partnerships. This is the role that we play, and not necessarily doing the relationship building. You might have people within your team that can do that, but being the orchestra conductor and being aware of these kind of things and building these kind of collaborations. I'm not going to go into that. Okay. And I can finish up here in the last, I know we're 4 minutes over. We're going to break in just a minute. I talked about all this. Leveraging resources, that's an important part of grant writing. I've given you some scenarios of how to leverage not only financial cash donations, but also human resources in the way of expertise, volunteers, and equipment would be the third category there. The front end dozer. Also in the human resource area, the carpenters, that was an example. The financial resources example there was the Boys and Girls Club. They're establishing a presence perhaps in your organization, and they're providing services free of charge to tribal members or at a very deep discount, which can then be converted into a savings. You can convert all of those things, financial, human, and equipment resources, into leveraging them and incorporating them in your grant. I hope that makes sense. Being able to always watch for those kinds of situations as grant writers. How can we leverage resources? So if the grant comes in and says there's a matching requirement, this might serve the need. Is there a question? Question?
Well, there's a few, but we can, how many more slides do you have?
I'm done with this section, basically. I talked about all this stuff.
We'll get to the questions in just a moment.
Okay. Yeah, we talked about all of this stuff. Keep in mind, last thing I want to say, Awarding points. A lot of grant applications will award points to some level. This is just an example of points that might be awarded for the leveraging resources based on the dollar amount that you are leveraging. As long as you have those, the backup that I was talking about, the memorandums of understanding, so you have proof, you might be able to convert your leveraging, your dollars that you are leveraging into points that can be awarded on your grant application. So increasing your chances. So to finish up, this is what we did in the first part here. We talked about the role of the grant writer. We talked about effective solicitation, how to solicit the community, and we also talked about putting together the project team. Next, after lunch, we're going to talk about getting into more detail on the SWOT analysis, short-term and goals, SMART goals. And we're also going to talk about navigating through grant opportunities. So, Crystal, I'm done with my section for the morning. Did you have some questions that I couldn't get to before?
Yes. Okay. Let's start off with, and Lito, if you're still in the room, I did see your hand up, so go ahead and toss your question in the chat, or just when I get a moment, after we've answered these few. Okay, give me 1 second. Paulette inquired, a lot of our needs are water and sewer. Do foundations focus on that?
Not necessarily. Foundations focus on all kinds of different things. Well, I'm going to talk about that. It's a good question. I'm going to talk about that when we come back this afternoon, what foundations and private sector do focus on and how to search for them. Some of them do focus on that, but they're all over the place. So you need to be able to narrow down your search. We're going to talk about how to do that this afternoon.
Okay. I got one more question. Rating factors. Are we going to talk about rating factors today?
We can. I didn't have it as a major component. What is your question? Or did you have one?
No, I just, so I'm working on the grant and it talks about rating factors and I don't really understand them, but maybe offline or something we can have a small discussion.
Yeah, or you can send that to me. If you have questions, send it to me directly, because that sounds like something that, you know, we can go through on a sidebar conversation. You can always email it to me.
Okay, thank you.
Is it for the ICDBG grant, Paulette?
Yes, ma'am.
I have some material and I also have another contact I can give you, because that's a little bit more, that falls more, you know, on that ICDBG line than it does, you know, our IHBG funding.
Okay, perfect.
Yeah.
Thank you, Crystal.
I agree with that.
You're welcome.
Yeah, we have an expert on that we can refer to.
Absolutely. And I have some material too that I can send your way that breaks that down. So,
Okay.
perfect.
Excellent.
Okay. I have Kathleen inquiring, how do contractors fit into the model? I'm a victim services manager and there are times we need outside contractors.
Trying to understand that question. Outside contractors, outside vendors, outside people, outside the organization that can help.
Yeah, Kathleen, do you mind unmuting and expanding a little bit?
Yeah. So there are times like we will need someone to like help us develop some type of a questionnaire, or we would have an outside contractor, which would be maybe someone who would be like a psychologist or a therapist to help with the trauma that the victims have suffered from. So how does that fit into the model? How would that be written into the model?
Oh.
For goals, as far as, because that is something that coming from I understand that this is, from what I'm getting, most of it is from developing housing, but I'm coming from a perspective of where we're helping community members that are in stress or trauma. So that's how does that fit into what
you'd use the, I'm not an expert in that particular area. You're talking,
Mhm.
I'm going back here, seeing if I can come up with the logic model, because the logic model fits all scenarios, even if it's not housing. Where'd it go? Bring it up. There it is. So your major initiative is going to be something different than education. It's going to be medical related, right?
Mhm.
So your initiative would be different. Your goal, you're probably going to have several goals under there. One of them would be the use of professional medical use of I don't know what the specific goal would be.
Mhm. It
Use
would be
of,
behavioral health is basically what it would be under. So that's
right.
where,
So the
yeah.
major initiative would be behavioral health.
Mhm.
And the goal would be to maybe one of the goals would be to contract with a series of professionals, medical professionals,
Okay.
or even more specific than that, to contract with a very specific type of medical practitioner. The outcome would be to secure a hypothetical outcome off the top of my head. The outcome would be to secure the contracts within a 90-day period.
Okay.
The result would be, how successful were you? Now that's just, that's just one. The second goal might be provide that service provider, that health service provider, with 15 clients. Outcome, well, maybe that's more of an outcome. The goal would be provide clients to medical practitioner, and the outcome would be certain amount of patients were seen by the medical practitioner. I'm getting I'm out of my comfort zone here. Talking about medical.
I totally get
But I
it.
think the first goal was more realistic, and that
Yeah.
is the initiative was healthcare. The goal was to contract with medical providers. The outcome would be, you can get, within a certain period of time, and then the result would be you were 90% successful, 100% successful, which is what you're going for,
Mhm.
success. But then you're more, you delve more deeply into the medical realm than I do. Your goals can be much more specific into given medical areas, healthcare
Well,
areas.
what we have attempted to do, because we haven't been successful in this venture, is to have set aside time for the providers to even we would pay them, even though if they didn't see a client or see a participant, we would have that set aside time for them so they would still get paid. So it would be kind of like an emergency opening for whatever our clients' needs were. That's, yeah,
That would
that's
be
how it would
another
have to be
initiative.
written.
Yeah, that would be another initiative.
Yeah. Okay.
From there,
I'm new at
you're gonna have
grant
to
writing.
use-
That's why I'm asking these questions.
Yeah, no, good. It's difficult for me to give you goals and outcomes and results because I'm not a healthcare professional. But
Okay.
you get the idea, I think, of the major initiative, and then having your subject matter experts who probably are more medical oriented than I am come in and say, let's break this down. How are we going to make this major initiative work and give you goals that are tangible? That's what the goal's all about.
Okay.
So if you want to send something to me by email, I'll be more than glad to look at it and once you have something put together, I can look at it and say, yeah, that makes sense. That sounds like a realistic goal that matches an initiative.
Okay.
And that outcome makes sense to me, but you're out of my comfort area.
Okay. Well, thank you for helping me, Vince.
No problem. No problem. And if there aren't any other questions, I think we're going to break, right, Crystal?
Sure.
Unless you have something else.
There are, yeah. I
Okay.
do want to acknowledge Lito if he's still, or this individual is still in the chat. I did see a hand up. So if you want to unmute, if you're still here, I'm looking.
Yeah, I'm still here.
Oh, beautiful. Go ahead, and I did see your hand up, so that's why I wanted to acknowledge.
Okay, yeah, I just wanted to share a going back to the leveraging, I just wanted to share a little that I saw on another tribe. Basically, they're using their casino for people to put their winnings, to cash out. You put your money into the machine. Well, it's going to ask you whether you want to round up your change for. I believe I saw on there it said recreation and infrastructure for the tribes. So round up your change and put it back into the tribes. I just thought that was an interesting idea that I saw for leveraging.
Absolutely.
So
That is quite interesting.
Yeah. Do they round up to the next dollar, do you know, or do they take it higher than that?
Yes, it was rounded up to the next dollar or however much you wanted to donate out of your winnings.
Wow, that's great. That's a great
Yeah,
idea.
interesting idea.
Yeah,
Yeah,
very.
thank you.
Thank you for
Linda.
sharing.
That's great.
Yeah.
I'm writing that
Okay.
one down.
Oh, sorry, Vince. Go ahead.
I said I'm writing that one down.
There you go, giving Vince ideas.
Yeah.
Okay, and then Jack Ramsey inquired, can we apply savings from leveraged resources toward a match?
Yeah. Savings, yeah. Right. Well, it depends on where the savings are coming from. If the savings are coming from, example, from the Indian Housing Block Grant, be careful of that. You might not be able to do that. You'd have to look at the regulations a little closer on that. But generally speaking, if the tribe or tribal entity has savings, that's basically the tribe giving a cash donation to to the grant. So generally speaking, the answer is yes, the tribe can do that. Be careful using federal funds for other federal funds. Be careful of that. That using IHBG funds, savings from IHBG funds for other federal funds is not allowed. So be careful where the source is, where the source of the savings is coming from, to make sure that you're not using federal funds to get federal funds. I hope that makes sense. Okay. That's my answer.
Beautiful. And then Paulette, I do see that you have your hand up again. I don't know if it was ever put down or if you're good. Going once, going twice. All right. Okay, guys. Vince, so that wraps up this part of the session, and then we'll be back